The mountain air at Fort Bradley smelled like metal and diesel fuel, with fog rolling through the pine trees like smoke. The landing pad never stopped humming, CH-47 Chinooks cycling in and out, their rotor wash keeping the frost-covered concrete in constant motion. Red floodlights cast everything in an eerie glow, and the sound of turbines spinning up echoed through the valley like mechanical thunder. Callie stepped off the transport van, her helmet tucked under one arm, and a hand-drawn flight diagram folded in her jacket pocket. She'd been drawing those diagrams for 3 years now, mapping altitudes, wind patterns, thermal drift zones, but nobody had ever asked to see them. The other pilots spent their downtime comparing approach speeds and swapping war stories. Callie spent hers outside in the cold, tracking weather patterns and memorizing terrain features that weren't in any manual. The assignment board glowed under the tense fluorescent lights, names printed on laminated strips and slotted into metal grooves. Her name sat at the bottom in the smallest font. Callie, observer only. No call sign, no flight status, no authority. Just quiet permission to ride along and keep her mouth shut. She didn't react. She'd learned not to. The ready tent buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Officers clustered around a heat lamp, their conversation full of military shorthand and acronyms. Callie recognized every term she'd been studying. Flight operations longer than some of them had been flying, but when she approached the group, the talking stopped. "Who's the new observer?" someone asked. "Callie something," another pilot shrugged. "She's riding up front to observe. No flight duties, just watch and stay out of the way." The words weren't cruel exactly, they were just policy. But they stung the same way they had for the past 18 months, ever since she'd first requested flight training. Her application had been under review for so long it had become a running joke among the admin staff. Chief Rivas walked past without acknowledgement, his voice carrying from the next table. "She's not flight rated for anything. Keep her in the jump seat and make sure she doesn't touch the controls." Callie adjusted her worn flight gloves, the ones she'd bought herself, not the crisp new ones issued to actual pilots. They were creased and softened with use, ready for controls she wasn't allowed to touch. Yet. As night deepened, the fog thickened into a gray wall that swallowed the landing lights. Pilots called out altitude corrections and fuel delays, their names traded like markers in some exclusive game. Callie's name was never mentioned. She didn't mind. She was busy memorizing the wind patterns that would matter when visibility dropped to 0. When her assigned Chinook began spinning up for the final exercise, she followed the crew without being asked. The crew chief barely glanced at her as she strapped into the forward jump seat, the same spot she'd occupied for dozens of flights, always watching, never participating. "Don't touch anything," the crew chief reminded her, though he didn't need to. She'd never been given the chance. As the helicopter lifted off into the black sky, Callie pulled out her hand-drawn diagram. One more time. Every ridgeline, every wind pattern, every thermal pocket was mapped in red ink. She'd been preparing for this moment longer than anyone knew, studying not just the aircraft but the sky itself. The flight crew settled into their rhythm, a choreography that didn't include her. But Callie kept watching, kept learning, kept preparing, because somewhere in the back of her mind she knew that someday, maybe soon, the sky would need her back. She just had to be ready when it did. By the second day, the cold had become just another piece of equipment, something you carried, but stopped noticing. The pace had quickened, aircraft turning faster, debriefs running shorter, and the instructors' voices growing sharper with each rotation. Callie had flown 3 cycles by then, all in the same forward jump seat, all in complete silence. Her assigned spot never changed, just behind the cockpit, strapped into the observer harness with no voice authorization, no flight commands, no access to navigation updates. She rode with her hands clasped over her gloves and her eyes locked forward, watching every control input, memorizing every procedure. The crew had begun calling her the placeholder when they thought she couldn't hear. Chief Rivas and his team, 2 flight techs and a door gunner named Merritt, had settled into a rhythm that flowed around her like water around a stone. She was the extra body, the empty seat filled to satisfy some regulation nobody really understood. "Why do we even need an observer?" Merritt had asked during the morning briefing. "She just sits there." "Orders," Rivas had replied with a shrug. "Someone upstairs wants eyes on the training. She's qualified to watch, not to fly." The briefings were held around a projection table in the mobile operations bay, pilots circling like sharks around the glowing grid. Each pilot got 5 minutes to adjust their landing zone vectors and ask questions. Callie got none. She sat on a folding bench at the edge of the tent just outside the circle of authority, invisible to the software that tracked pilot IDs. Once, she'd raised her hand quietly to make a suggestion about wind patterns near the eastern ridge. The junior controller with the clipboard had waved her off without looking up. "You're not flight rated for insertions. Hold questions for post-flight." She'd lowered her hand and said nothing more. But later, when she checked the weather telemetry station behind the fuel tent, her suspicions were confirmed. The downdraft pattern was forming exactly where she'd predicted, near landing zone 9. The ridge absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, creating a thermal pocket that would trap aircraft in a dangerous wind shear. She pulled out her diagram and drew the corrected approach path in red ink, 2 loops instead of 1, tighter than the standard pattern. If the cloud bank settled as predicted, visibility would vanish just before the final turn. The standard approach would become a death trap. Nobody had asked for her input, so she kept the information to herself. That night, she was reassigned to a different Chinook for what they called a secondary observation slot. The new crew chief looked her over once and pointed to the back of the aircraft. "Rear seat only. Don't touch anything. Don't speak unless it's a safety issue." She nodded and took her place in the frayed but clean jump seat. The turbines spun up with their familiar whine, and she closed her eyes for just a moment to identify the subtle pitch differences between the front and rear. Rotors. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. She didn't reach for her diagram. It was already memorized. During the post-flight debrief, one pilot made a casual comment while pulling off his gloves. "Makes me nervous when they're that quiet," his friend replied without smiling. "Doesn't mean she knows what she's doing. Just means she's used to being ignored." Neither looked at her. They didn't need to. She'd become part of the background, like the hum of generators or the smell of aviation fuel. Just another piece of equipment that someone had decided was necessary but not important. The debrief tent buzzed with talk about drift tolerances and how one aircraft had nearly clipped a communications tower on descent. The pilot who'd made the approach laughed it off. "Didn't feel that close to me." Callie didn't speak, but she'd seen the telemetry data. She'd watched the crosswind readings too, and she knew that pilot's chosen route would become impossible after nightfall. Her notes said so. Her carefully drawn flight paths said so. Nobody asked. Standing outside the tent afterward, she watched fog move between the landing pads in low, brushing curls. The Chinooks sat in shadow, cooling under the open sky. The final rotation was about to begin, the one that would test everyone's limits. When visibility dropped to 0, she folded her updated diagram and slipped it back into her flight suit. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow someone would need what she knew. But deep down, she was starting to wonder if tomorrow would ever come. The operations tent had grown quiet as the final training flights wound down. Most crews were rolling. Through equipment logs, their voices low and tired. The chalkboard had been half erased, and someone had pulled back the canvas wall to let cold air clear out the accumulated haze of coffee and exhaust fumes. Callie sat in her usual spot at the edge of the tent, helmet beside her boot, her hand-drawn diagram tucked safely in her flight suit pocket. The simulation was nearly over. In a few hours, everyone would pack up and head back to their regular assignments, and she'd return to her desk job, filing reports and updating training schedules. Then the radio crackled. "Inject, live final. Evac East Ridge. Landing zone degraded, extraction team requesting immediate pickup. No beacon. 10-minute window." The tent fell silent. One of the instructors looked up from his terminal, confusion creasing his face. "That can't be real. No injects after 2100 hours. But the controller's voice came through again, crisp and urgent. "Inject confirmed. Final pickup. No automated navigation support. Grid reference only." The silence stretched. Half the crew chiefs muttered about equipment status. One navigator flipped through his checklist, lips pressed tight. A Chinook pilot started to volunteer, then hesitated. "My bird's cooked," he said, finally. "Overheating on the last set-down." Chief Rivas looked over his shoulder, scanning the room. "That's the worst possible landing zone to run cold. The wind shear alone." He pulled off his headset. "Who's up?" No one answered. The silence thickened, broken only by the creak of folding chairs and the distant hum of generators. Callie felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that. Landing zone. She'd studied it, mapped it, flown it in her mind 100 times. The Eastern Ridge was a nightmare in good weather. In degraded conditions with no navigation support, it was nearly impossible. Nearly. The shuffle of boots was almost imperceptible as she rose from her bench. Her voice cut across the tent like a blade. "I can take it?" Every head turned. Some blinked, unsure who had spoken. Others narrowed their eyes in recognition of the quiet observer who'd been haunting their flights for months. Callie stood calm, one hand briefly touching the pocket, where her diagram rested. "I've reviewed the Eastern Ridge twice. I've logged the downdraft offset and the fog pocket forming over the saddle. I know the approach." Merritt, the door gunner, scoffed. "You've never even flown a full rotation?" "Correct," Callie nodded. "But I've studied this specific approach in blackout conditions. I have the sequence memorized. I can bring us in low, under the fog band. The east saddle's still clear. It will close in 6 minutes." Someone near the map table muttered, "She's guessing." "No," Callie said quietly. "I've already seen it." The tent held its breath. Chief Rivas studied her face, his expression unreadable. "You think you can run this blind? No beacon, partial telemetry, degraded landing zone?" "Yes." "And if you're wrong?" "Then you take control." "But I won't be wrong." The controller's voice cut through the tension. "Landing zone is live. Clock is ticking." Rivas held her gaze for another long moment, then reached for his headset. "Spin up the bird." He handed her the communications gear, his grip steady, but his eyes intense. 1 minute in the seat. You miss that turn, I take control. Callie took the headset, her fingers wrapping around it like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "I won't miss it." As the crew broke into motion, voices rising, equipment clattering, boots pounding toward the aircraft, Callie moved through the chaos with supernatural calm. She ducked under the tent flap, walked through the mist, rolling off the landing pad, and stepped onto the Chinook's loading ramp as it lowered. Her boots hit the steel deck like she'd always belonged there. In the cockpit, the pilot's seat had been prepared. Rivas was already strapping in beside her, his expression tense but no longer doubtful. Callie settled into the left seat and clipped her harness across her chest, her movements precise and practiced. The Chinook began to wake beneath her hands. Outside, someone called for blade clearance. The rotors shifted with a shudder, then smoothed into their familiar rhythm. Inside the flight deck, the lights dimmed, and the controls glowed softly under her fingers. Some readouts blinked warnings, standard for the simulation's jamming protocol. The fog outside crept higher, and she knew they had maybe 4 minutes before the approach window closed completely. She slipped her diagram into the side panel. Though she wouldn't need it again. Every line was burned into her memory. The flight wouldn't be long. Just one approach, one landing, one chance to prove that all those months of watching and waiting had been building to this moment. Everything was about to change. The Chinook rumbled beneath Callie as the rotors wound up to full power. The cockpit. Lights cast a soft green glow across the instrument panels, and outside, fog glimmered red under the landing pad's warning lights. She sat perfectly still in the pilot's seat, harness locked, fingers resting on the cyclic control stick. Behind her, voices carried from the cabin, nervous whispers from crew members who'd never seen her do more than sit quietly in the observer seat. "She's just backup, right?" someone asked. "No," came the reply. "She's flying it." "But she's not flight certified." "She is now." The cabin fell silent. In the co-pilot seat, Chief Rivas made final adjustments to his instruments, his movements. Quick and precise. His eyes never fully left her, but she could feel his attention shifting from doubt to careful observation. He was ready to take control if she faltered, but something in his posture suggested he no longer expected her to fail. Callie reached for the collective control and brought it up gently, just enough to test the aircraft's response. No delay. The engines sounded clean and strong. One warning light blinked amber, normal for a rapid startup sequence. She acknowledged it, cleared it, and moved on. The navigation screen beside her flickered twice and went dark. No map overlay, no digital. Terrain display. The simulation's jamming protocol had activated, cutting them off from automated guidance systems. She'd expected this. In fact, she'd been preparing for it. "You sure about the flight path?" Rivas asked quietly. "Yes." He nodded once and looked forward. "Control, this is ridge rotation. Spinning up and requesting clearance for final inject. East ridge." The reply was immediate. "Clearance confirmed. Launch authorized. No navigation assistance available." Callie's voice was steady. "Copy. Lifting now." She brought the collective up and nudged the cyclic forward. The Chinook rose off the pad with a low, shuddering growl, its massive frame fighting the crosswind that always plagued the mountain base. The rear wheels broke free of the concrete, and suddenly they were airborne. Wind struck from the left, sudden, vicious, and strong enough to slam the entire aircraft sideways. For a moment the nose drifted dangerously close to the control tower. In the cabin, someone grabbed an overhead strap, but Callie didn't panic. She didn't overcorrect. She simply rolled her left wrist slightly, adjusted the pedals with her feet, and held the aircraft steady with her fingertips. The wind caught. The edge of the fuselage slid across the metal skin and moved on. The Chinook stabilized, balanced, and controlled. "Drift corrected," she said into her headset. "Bearing north-northeast, holding saddle approach. ETA to ridge, 2 minutes." From the co-pilot seat, Rivas reached toward the emergency controls, then stopped. He watched her hand on the cyclic, steady, unmoving, completely confident. He let his hand fall away. The route ahead was a wall of black fog, the kind of darkness that swallowed light and hope in equal measure. The only visible reference points were the red glow of her shoulder beacon and the faint shimmer of frost forming on the cockpit windows. But Callie didn't need to see the terrain. She'd memorized every contour, every thermal pattern, every wind current that flowed through the mountain passes. She flew by instinct and preparation, her mind filled with the hand-drawn maps she'd created during those long, lonely months of being ignored. The Chinook banked left in a controlled turn. "Terrain feature in 5 seconds," she announced calmly. "Reducing collective 2%, holding angle." Rivas exhaled softly. The voices in the cabin had gone completely silent. Ahead, through a brief gap in the fog, came the flicker of emergency flares. The extraction team was down there somewhere, waiting in the dark on a narrow plateau that most pilots would never attempt to reach in perfect weather. Callie brought the aircraft lower, her corrections smooth and precise. She was flying the ridgeline completely blind, and every adjustment was perfect. From behind, the door gunner leaned forward in his harness, squinting through the cargo bay. "She's locked on," he said, his voice filled with something between amazement and relief. "She's really locked on." The landing zone appeared below them like a miracle, a small clearing illuminated by flares, with a group of figures waving frantically from the slope. Callie flared the aircraft expertly and brought the landing gear down with surgical precision. The wheels touched earth without even a bounce. "Ramp down," she called. "Loading in 30 seconds." The extraction team sprinted toward them, heads low beneath the rotor wash. Within moments they were aboard, the ramp was sealed, and Callie was lifting them back into the darkness. Chief Rivas looked at her with something that might have been awe. "You've got it," he said simply. She nodded once, her attention already focused on the return flight. The hardest part was yet to come, navigating back through the deteriorating weather with a full load and limited fuel. But for the first time in months, Callie wasn't the observer anymore. She was exactly where she belonged, in control, in command, and finally given the chance to show what she could do. The sky had needed her after all. The return flight was where everything could go wrong. The fog had thickened into an almost solid wall, and the wind had shifted to a more aggressive pattern that threw the heavy Chinook around like a toy. Callie kept one hand on the cyclic, the other ready near the throttle controls, but she never wavered. Behind her, the extracted team sat in stunned silence. Most had never seen the cockpit from this angle, never watched a pilot navigate purely by instinct through conditions that would ground most aircraft. They couldn't look away. "Terrain rising," Callie announced calmly, "adjusting altitude, compensating for wind shear." The navigation systems were still dark, their screens showing nothing but static. Every course correction came from her memory of the hand-drawn maps, every altitude change based on the subtle shifts in engine pitch that told her when they were approaching rising ground. A massive gust slammed into the right side of the aircraft, tilting the entire frame at a dangerous angle. One of the extraction team members grabbed his seat rail, eyes wide with terror. Chief Rivas reached instinctively for the emergency controls, but stopped when he saw Callie's response. Her hand was already moving, making minute adjustments to counter the wind before the aircraft could destabilize. "Counter vector aligned," she said simply. "Stabilizing." The shuddering stopped. The Chinook flew on, steady as a heartbeat. In the cabin, Merritt finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding. "She's not just flying it," he whispered to no one in particular. "She's reading the sky." The fog began to show hints of orange glow ahead, the landing pad lights penetrating the mist. They were almost home, but this was the most dangerous part of any flight. The approach required threading between radio towers and power lines, all invisible in the thick cloud cover. "Landing pattern in sight," Callie reported. "Beginning final approach sequence." She brought them in wide, circling once to align with the wind patterns she'd memorized, then dropped low for the final descent. The approach was textbook perfect, smooth, controlled, and exactly where it needed to be. "Touchdown in 10 seconds, she announced. The wheels kissed the concrete with barely a whisper. The engines wound down, the rotors began their slow spin toward stillness, and the rescue was complete. In the sudden quiet, the extraction team filed out without speaking. One of them paused at the bottom of the ramp, looked back at Callie through the open cargo bay, and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." She nodded once in acknowledgement. As Callie powered down the systems one by one, Chief Rivas sat motionless in the co-pilot seat, looking like a man waking from a profound dream. "That was—" he started, then stopped. "In 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything like that." Outside, ground crews had gathered, more people than usual, drawn by word that something extraordinary had just happened. They watched as Callie stepped out of the aircraft, helmet under her arm, hair damp with sweat from the intense concentration. She walked calmly across the landing pad, her boots echoing on the concrete. The rotors spun slower now, ticking down from their operational speed. People were pointing, whispering, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Inside the operations tent, the buzz of voices stopped dead when someone shouted, "They made it back!" Screens lit up with telemetry data from the flight. Perfect slope angles, clean descent profiles, drift corrections that looked like they'd been calculated by computer, but had actually come from pure instinct. "Who was the pilot?" Someone asked, looking at the assignment board where Callie's name still appeared only as Observer. Chief Rivas followed her into the tent, his helmet still in his hands, his expression unreadable. "She flew it start to finish," he announced to the room. "Every correction, every descent, every approach, that was all her." The room fell silent again. The crew chief at the console pulled up the flight telemetry on his screen. The data didn't lie. Perfect performance from takeoff to landing, 2 minutes ahead of the mission window. Not a single system pushed beyond normal parameters. "Call sign?" someone asked, looking at the blank space on the mission board. No one answered immediately. The board stayed empty, but the screen told the whole story. She had done what no one else had even volunteered to attempt, and she'd done it flawlessly. For the first time in her military career, Callie wasn't just the observer. She was the pilot everyone would be talking about for years to come. But More importantly, she was finally exactly where she belonged. The debrief room was packed wall to wall the next morning. Folding chairs scraped against concrete, thermal coffee mugs steamed in the cold air, and the hum of projectors filled the spaces between conversations. Most of the flight crews had stripped down to base layers, their boots still dusted with frost from the night's operations. Lieutenant Sharp stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, flight notes tucked under one arm. He didn't look at Callie, who sat quietly on a low bench along the far edge of the tent, half in shadow. Her helmet rested beside her, visor down, untouched. "Last rotation," the controller announced, pulling up the mission data on the main screen. "Inject extract, east, ridge." The room buzzed with casual conversation, most assuming it would be another routine training review. Sharp stepped forward, his expression more serious than usual. "This one's different," he said. "No pre-brief, no ground beacon, partial navigation." Blackout. We had one shot to reach the extraction team. Someone in the front row leaned forward. "Who flew it?" Sharp didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded to the operator beside the console. The main screen cut to black, then lit up with helmet camera footage. No dramatic music, no introduction, just the silent roll of motion. The footage opened with low-altitude navigation, the Chinook slipping beneath the cloud layer like a ghost. The fog glowed in sharp red pulses as the aircraft's interior lights cycled. The only sound was the steady rhythm of controlled breathing. In the pilot's headset, in the corner of the screen, flight telemetry ran in real time. Altitude drops in perfect increments, wind speeds matched with precise collective adjustments, drift corrections logged within acceptable margins. Every timestamp ticked cleanly. "Forward." From the back of the room, someone exhaled sharply. "That's not simulated navigation. She's flying it completely by hand." A few heads turned, but no one looked directly at Callie. On the screen, the footage followed the final approach toward the ridgeline. Emergency flares burst into view, and the aircraft's visor reflected the light briefly as the Chinook dipped low and flared for landing. The timing was exact. The touchdown was perfect. No bounce, no hesitation. In a second window, the landing zone overlay drew itself in real time, showing the computer's analysis of the approach path. The route Callie had taken was the only one clear of wind shear and thermal turbulence. The simulation's weather modeling, running post-flight analysis, confirmed that she had somehow seen conditions that the instruments couldn't measure. She predicted the wind patterns before our systems could model them," someone whispered from the front row. On the video, the extraction team loaded quickly and efficiently. The ramp sealed, the aircraft lifted off, and then came the return flight. The truly dangerous part. Another crosswind slammed into the Chinook, threatening to throw it into the mountainside. But Callie's voice cut through the headset feed, calm and certain. "Counter vector aligned. Stabilizing." The aircraft steadied instantly, as if the wind had simply decided to obey. The footage ended with the final approach to base, another textbook landing executed in near-zero visibility. The timestamp showed 21:58, 2 minutes inside the mission window, with fuel to spare. Complete silence filled the debrief room. Chief Rivas stepped forward from his position along the side wall. His jacket was still zipped, his helmet strap tucked neatly into his collar. He looked at the instructors, then at the mission board where the pilot column still showed blank. "Pilot in command," he said clearly. "Callie, score, 100%. A murmur broke through the room, but no one laughed. No one challenged it. The telemetry data was undeniable. Lieutenant Sharp dropped his flight notes. They hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. The operator at the console looked at the mission board, picked up a dry erase marker, and wrote her name in the pilot column. Just Callie. No rank, no call sign. She didn't need them anymore. The extraction team, still in their field gear from the night before, had filed in during the video. One of them pointed at the screen, then at her. He said something under his breath to his teammates, and they all nodded. They didn't applaud or cheer. They just stood there, looking at her with the kind of respect reserved for people who do impossible things and make them look routine. The instructors gathered near the console, whispering among themselves. One looked at the telemetry readings, then back at the replay footage. "She flew that entire approach from visual memory," he said quietly. "No navigation aids, no instrument. Guidance. That flight pattern wasn't even in our database." Sharp finally turned toward Callie, his expression neither harsh nor gentle, just the look of someone seeing a mystery they couldn't solve. "She wasn't cleared for command pilot status," he said flatly. Chief Rivas didn't flinch. "She is now." The score remained on the screen, 100.0%. The telemetry ran again in the corner, looped automatically by the system. Perfect performance, beginning to end. Merritt stepped into the tent last, ducking under the flap and pausing near the coffee station. He looked at the board, then at Callie, and gave a slight nod. Not mocking this time, just quiet acknowledgement. Callie stood slowly, picked up her helmet, and walked past the assembled crowd without looking for permission. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her right to leave. Outside, the fog was lifting, and the sky was beginning to show hints of blue. For the first time in her military career, Callie's name was on the board not as an observer, but as a pilot. And everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. Word traveled fast through the base. By afternoon, Callie's flight had become the subject of quiet conversations in every hangar, mess hall, and barracks. The video footage was making its way through official channels marked for command review and instructor training. She wasn't famous, military culture doesn't work that way, but she was known. The change was subtle, but immediate. When she walked into the ready tent that evening, the conversation didn't stop, but it shifted. Pilots made room at the briefing table without being asked. The equipment sergeant handed her a new flight suit with her name embroidered on the chest, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "Pilot in Command." Chief Rivas found her checking weather reports near the communications station. "We've got a new assignment," he said, holding a folder marked with the red stripe of urgent priority. "Search and rescue qualification flights. They want you to lead the instruction sequence." Callie looked up from the meteorological data she'd been studying. "Lead instructor?" "Lead pilot," he corrected. "They want other pilots to learn how to fly the way you do, especially in degraded conditions." She took the folder and opened it. Inside were the profiles of 8 experienced pilots, all requesting advanced training in instrument-free navigation. At the bottom of the first page, a handwritten note from the base commander established new protocols based on yesterday's performance. Priority Alpha. "They want me to teach what I did last night?" Rivas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. "They want you to teach pilots how to think like you, how to see weather patterns that don't show up on instruments, how to fly with their instincts instead of just their training." Over the following weeks, Callie found herself in a position she'd never imagined: authority. Her flight techniques were being studied, documented, and incorporated into the base's training curriculum. Junior pilots sought her out for advice on reading wind patterns. Senior officers consulted her on route planning for difficult missions. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. She still drew her flight diagrams by hand, but now other pilots asked to see them. She still preferred to work alone, but now she had a team of instructors eager to learn her methods. Most importantly, she was no longer invisible. Her voice carried weight in briefings. Her suggestions were implemented, not dismissed. When she recommended changes to standard approach procedures, the flight operations manual was updated accordingly. Lieutenant Sharp, who had initially questioned her credentials, became one of her strongest supporters. What she did that night, he told the base commander, that wasn't luck or instinct. That was a different level of preparation. She'd been ready for that moment for years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The observer who had been overlooked for so long was now setting the standard for everyone else to follow. But Callie handled the recognition the same way she'd handled the isolation, with quiet professionalism and unwavering focus on the work itself. She didn't need validation from others anymore. She'd found something more valuable, the knowledge that when the moment came, she'd been ready. And now she was helping others find that same readiness in themselves. The mountain air still smelled like metal and fog, the Chinooks still cycled through their rotations, and the landing pad still hummed with constant activity. But something fundamental had changed at Fort Bradley. The observer had become the observed, the student had become the teacher, and the pilot who had once been denied flight status was now writing the book on what it meant to truly fly. 6 months later, Callie stood at the same assignment board where her name had once appeared, in the smallest font as observer only. Now it was printed in bold letters at the top, Chief Flight Instructor, Advanced Navigation. Below it, a list of pilots scheduled for her specialized training program. The mountain base had become a different place. The techniques she had developed, reading thermal patterns by engine sound, navigating by windshift timing, approaching landing zones through instinct and preparation rather than instruments, had become standard curriculum. Pilots from other bases came to Fort Bradley specifically to train under her program, but the real change was in the culture itself. The ready tent that had once buzzed with exclusion and casual dismissal now operated with a different energy. Young pilots who showed unconventional thinking were encouraged rather than sidelined. Observers were given chances to prove themselves. The phrase, "just watch and stay out of the way," had disappeared from the vocabulary entirely. Callie still arrived early and stayed late, still hand-drew her flight diagrams, still preferred to work through problems alone before sharing solutions with others. But now these habits were seen as dedication rather than stubbornness, expertise rather than overreach. Chief Rivas, now her deputy instructor, found her one evening at the weather station, updating her charts with the latest atmospheric data. "The new class starts tomorrow," he said. 12 pilots, including 2 from overseas exchange programs. "They're all here because they heard about what you did that night." She looked up from her work. "They're here to learn advanced navigation techniques. What happened that night was just the application of preparation." "Maybe," he said with a slight smile. "But they're also here because word got out that there's a place where being different isn't a liability, where thinking outside standard procedures is actually valued." The next morning, Callie walked into the briefing room to find 12 pilots seated around the table, some young, some experienced, all eager to learn. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same hunger for knowledge, the same determination to excel that she'd carried during her own months of observation. "Good morning," she said simply. "I'm Callie. Before we talk about flying, I want you to understand something. Everything you think you know about impossible missions is about to change." She moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple mountain ridge with quick, confident strokes. 6 months ago, I sat where you're sitting now. I was told I wasn't qualified, wasn't ready, wasn't good enough. I spent 18 months watching others fly while I was relegated to observer status. She turned back to face the group. "But I never stopped preparing. I never stopped learning. And when the moment came, when everyone else said it couldn't be done, I was ready." One of the younger pilots raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you prepare for something you've never been allowed to do?" Callie smiled, recognizing something of her former self in the question. "You prepare by understanding that permission and preparation are 2 different things. You can't control when you'll get your chance, but you can control whether you'll be ready when it comes." She spent the next hour walking them through the fundamentals of intuitive flying, how to read wind patterns by the way frost forms on aircraft surfaces, how to predict thermal pockets by observing ground temperature variations, how to navigate in zero visibility by listening to subtle changes in engine harmonics. "The instruments will fail you," she told them. "The weather will surprise you. The mission parameters will change without warning. But if you've done the work, if you've truly prepared, you'll have something no computer can give you: understanding." During the afternoon flight exercise, she watched from the control tower as her students attempted their first instrument-free approaches. Some struggled, fighting against years of training that had taught them to trust technology over instinct. Others began to find their rhythm, discovering capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Later, as the sun set behind the mountain peaks and the landing pads glowed with their familiar red lights, Callie found herself back at the weather station. It had become her thinking place, the spot where she processed the day's lessons and planned for tomorrow's challenges. A young pilot named Davis approached hesitantly. He'd been one of the strugglers during the afternoon exercise, his approach wavering and uncertain. "Ma'am, I wanted to ask, when you made that flight 6 months ago, weren't you scared?" Callie considered the question carefully. Terrified, she said finally. But fear and readiness aren't opposites. I was scared because I understood exactly how difficult it was going to be. But I was also ready because I'd been preparing for that exact scenario for years. How did you know it would happen? I didn't know when, but I knew it would happen eventually. Some impossible mission that everyone else would say couldn't be done. And I decided that when it did, I wanted to be the person who could do it. Davis nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. So the real training wasn't learning to fly. It was learning to be ready. Exactly. As Davis walked away, Callie reflected on how much had changed since that foggy night when she'd stepped forward and said, "I can take it." The observer who had been overlooked and dismissed was now shaping the next generation of pilots. The quiet preparation that had once seemed like futile effort was now recognized as the foundation of excellence. Her name was permanently etched on the mission board now, no longer as an observer but as the standard by which others measured themselves. The techniques she'd developed were being taught at flight schools across the country. The culture of exclusion that had kept her sidelined was being replaced by one that valued preparation over politics, competence over credentials. But perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. When young pilots with unconventional ideas or unproven backgrounds walked into the ready tent now, they weren't told to sit quietly in the corner. They were given charts to study, techniques to master, and the chance to prove what they could do when the moment finally came. The fog rolled in that evening, just as it had 6 months before. The Chinooks sat silent on their pads, waiting for tomorrow's missions. And somewhere in the ready tent, a new group of pilots studied hand-drawn diagrams and weather patterns, preparing for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. Callie smiled as she folded her latest charts and headed back to quarters. The cycle was beginning again: observation, preparation, opportunity, and transformation. But now it was happening to others, guided by the knowledge that no dream is too impossible if you're willing to do the work when no one is watching. The sky would always need people who were ready. And thanks to what had started that night in the fog, there would always be pilots prepared to answer the call. In a world where recognition often comes to those who demand it loudest, Callie's story remained a quiet reminder that the most powerful victories are won not with noise and bluster, but with patient preparation and the unshakable conviction that your moment will come. When it does, the only question that matters is whether you'll be ready. For Callie, the answer had always been yes. The observer became the instructor. The overlooked became the indispensable. And the pilot, who was once denied flight status, became the one who rewrote the rules for everyone who came after. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or told you weren't ready, remember Callie's story. Your preparation isn't wasted. Your patience isn't weakness. And when your moment comes, let your work speak louder than any words ever could. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who've been getting ready all along. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. What part of Callie's journey inspired you the most? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to prove yourself against all odds? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else who's quietly preparing for their moment to shine. Thanks for watching, and remember, your preparation today is building the foundation for tomorrow's breakthrough. Keep going, keep preparing, and keep believing in yourself. We'll see you in the next story.